Hi, folks. Welcome to our weekly chat about local history. Thanks for joining me as always. Boy, is it hot out there. Those of you who are watching live, we're in the middle of a heat wave, several days of possible 90-degree temperatures. We might actually break records. And someone today I had bumped into had said out loud to a friend, and I'd overheard it, and they looked toward me and they said, I don't remember uh, ever having this many consecutive days of 90 degrees. And I said, well, 1933, 1948, 1953. And he laughed. And I was kind of half kidding, but we have had this before. Maybe we forget about it, or because, again, that nostalgia effect that we talked about before, where we look at the past a little differently than we do the present. But we have been through 90-degree temperatures before over several days. And it got me, the reason I knew the answer to this, and I kind of jokingly yelled out dates that were in my head, because I uh, get into a habit of if there's an event in the present day, weather related most of the time, I look back in the old newspapers and weather reports to try to find where when the last time was we had a weather like this, or if there's any similarities. We often think you'll hear on TV about unprecedented, and yes, there is our reports from scientists of climate change and how the weather is more extreme today, and more often do we get the extremes than it was before. But we have had extreme temperatures before, and so that's not new. The reason, again, I knew the answer to the question of when we've had the last consecutive days of 90-degree weather is because I had just researched it. In order to I put a post on the Aurora Town Historians Facebook page, and I'll share that in the comments here. But a newspaper clipping from June of 1933. And that was the last time, that was the hottest June day on record in Buffalo. Um, but there's been other days as well. In August of 1948, actually August 27th of 1948 to be precise, was the hottest day in Buffalo history. Now, there's a difference between, as you know, the local weather reports. Say somebody has a thermometer on the side of their house in East Aurora. You'll see that in old newspaper articles quite a bit, where a newspaper editor or a country correspondent will report what they saw on their thermometer. First, that's not completely scientific, and also it's not the official National Weather Service recording. So you might see the same day. The record in Buffalo is different than what someone reported in a local community, and that's why. And that happened often, and that did happen in 1933 as well. But the hottest day in Buffalo history, we've never hit 100 degrees in Buffalo officially. Maybe we'll break that record this week, not sure. But it was 99 degrees on August 27, 1948. And I took a look back in the local newspaper, the Easter Advertiser, and I found that they had made a mention of it, not a big deal about it, but they were happening to have the South Wales Fair that week, which is kind of interesting because South Wales Community Hall just hosted a fair this past weekend, reminiscent of the old fairs they used to have at the South Wales Community Hall from the 1920s through the 1960s. So I thought it was kind of ironic that this was the week they had the fair, but they used to do them in late August and going into September sometimes, I believe. But they talked about how they, despite all this heat, the record-breaking heat in that August 1948, in that week, that the South Wales Fair went on and people struggled through. But that was really the only mention of the heat that time, where it had hit 99 degrees. Another time that you'll see, and the reason I know these numbers is that you can just Google the National Weather Service online, has great charts. So if you ever want to know the hottest day in Buffalo, the coldest day in Buffalo, the coldest June day in Buffalo, the hottest June day in Buffalo, or for various months, you can absolutely look through, and it's very easy to read. So if you're ever curious about that, so really what I did, is it wasn't really complicated, is took that lists of the records, the record highs, and then I just looked in the newspaper records for the week that corresponded to those highs. In this case, the high record temperatures. I also have done them for the low temperatures as well. But that's what I did in this case. So that's how I found out these numbers. It's not magic. It's really just doing a little simple research. So you can do that too if you're curious about what the hottest day in Buffalo or any city was. Also, September, the hottest day in September ever recorded, it was in early September of 1953. Officially 98 in Buffalo. We've had a few 98s. And in East Aurora, according to the newspaper, again, not scientific, we recorded 96 in 1953. And they mentioned that in a little article in the paper. And so a lot of times the local newspaper will mention it. You'll see it throughout history. They'll mention the weather, which I find interesting because as much as technology has changed over the years, how we predict the weather, um, and just the way weather impacts our lives. We drive now. Back in the 1800s, we wouldn't have had cars. And with all the things associated with snow, and the weather impacts us a little bit differently. But what I did notice is throughout history, we have talked about the weather. Weather has been a talking point and a conversation starter for a long time. And it's just something that we all can relate to, and we just tend to bring it up a lot. So I noticed that in the newspapers where they talk about the weather, whether it be the snow and the cold weather in the winter or the heat in the summer, it's always a talking point. So the newspaper, even if they wouldn't let time go by without recording that history. One of the best examples is back to June of 1933, which was the hottest June day recorded. And I went back and looked in the newspaper, and there was a great little article in the Easter Advertiser about it. And what I thought was really interesting, from a historian's perspective and from someone who studies history, if you do, it's just was interesting to read the words, and I'll read them to you, of the whoever wrote this little article back then. Even in our thermometer, which friends say registers too low in winter, read nearly 120 in the open Tuesday. Now remember, that was their little thermometer, unscientific, and actually it was, I believe, 98 degrees in Buffalo that day, so not 120. So the official was still in the 90s. But they said that the local thermometer was 120. And it was hotter on Wednesday. And it was. Wednesday was actually the day that Buffalo broke the record. The Advertiser editors went on to say, "We're not claiming this to be a record, nor making any statements about it being the hottest weather ever known here. This article is just for the people who save their favorite community paper for local history and may want to know when we had a fairly warm spell hereabouts." And I thought that was really interesting that they were thinking about me as I was researching that. I thought, wow, it's sort of like I was, in a weird way, connecting to the editor of the newspaper in 1933 who was writing about the fact that they were recording the weather for people like me in the future who would be looking back to see what the weather was like. And when there was a warm or hot spell, in fact, looking for other hot spells, they kind of knew that we would be looking back, maybe not so far ahead in history in 2024, but I just thought it was interesting that they sort of had this view of the future that we might be looking back and thought about us to record it in the newspaper. So I thought that was quite interesting. It got so hot that day, that week in 1933, that a piece of Buffalo Road they recorded just outside the village expanded, and that it sort of warped, and so they had to report it to the highway departments to get it fixed, that it was that hot. That also wasn't the first time that happened. We have a great photograph, which I'll put in the comments as well, of Olean Road, when the bricks on Olean Road had shifted because the heat got so hot that the bricks on the road shifted. So I thought that was interesting too, that the roads actually were damaged from the heat. So we have had heat waves before. This week might be a record breaker, so we might shatter all those previous records I was just talking about, and maybe in 50, 100 years, some other historian will be talking about the heat wave we had this week. So, and we need to record it. Again, I talked about journaling recently. Weather is one of the things that people in the old-fashioned journals, 1800s, early 1900s, that's something they recorded, which is really important because, yeah, we have the official Buffalo weather at the airport today. It would have been somewhere else before the airport. But to get the weather reports and what's happening, as you know, the weather can be different here in East Aurora than it is up in Buffalo or the North Towns, even a couple miles away. So it's really important to record that history. So I appreciate that the editors of the East Aurora Advertiser thought in 1933 to make sure to record what was happening here. And similarly, I like to think we will record this this week, which could be a record um, uh, for future generations who may look back to see what the weather was like the last time, you know, during one of these warm weeks, and they want to know what we were thinking and what we were doing. One of the interesting differences that they don't talk about in the articles is they wouldn't have had air conditioning like we do today. It was invented, but they wouldn't have had them in homes. A lot of businesses wouldn't have had air conditioning. And actually, in 1933, there's an article, one of the articles in the local newspaper, the Easter Advertiser, had an article about Max Cadet, who ran the clothing store that many of you may have recognized from the name, which is where part of Vidler's is today. It talks about he passed out from the heat and he had to go home and recover. He was fine. He just had a little heat stroke, they said. But that was part of what was happening, and they didn't say it was the lack of air conditioning because they didn't have it. They didn't know they were supposed to have it, but they didn't know what they were missing. But today, we looking back on it, you know, it'd be much different how they related to heat. Um, we have a lot of us have central air even in our homes. If not, we have like air conditioning units. We have fans. There's a great picture of Albert Hubbard with a fan, and it was the new age thing, new wave thing, new technology back at the turn of 1800s to the 1900s. They just didn't have these things. So today we take for granted that you go into a public building, to a store, and they have air conditioning. Um, the heat waves of 1933, 1948, and even 1953 wouldn't have had the air conditioning that we have today. And air conditioning in cars, big deal. They wouldn't have had that either. So the heat waves are similar, but the way we are able to cope with them is a little different. And that's something you would record in your journal or to pass on to future generations is how we, you know, back then they might have opened windows and gone outside. Today we shut all the windows and go inside during a heat wave like this. So it's a little different. Thanks again for joining me for these videos. Again, I'm Robert Goller, the Town and Village Historian, but these videos and a lot of my research are done separately, so they are not part of my official duties as Town and Village Historian. Thank you for listening. I've been getting great feedback, and feel free to drop comments in the comment section or send me a private message, as many of you do, with feedback or memories of previous heat waves. Or if you have a topic idea. I have a running list of topics that I'm trying to get to. It's a good problem to have too many topics for the weeks. But keep them coming, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. Thanks again for joining me. Keep warm or keep cool. Oh, you're already warm enough. Keep cool, stay hydrated, and we'll see you next time. And as always, thanks for keeping history alive. Take care.